This is episode 265 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drengmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, to say this was an eventful, frustrating, and historical week would be a considerable understatement. And we've got a lot to talk about over the next hour or so.
Yes, many things happened this past week, and and it'll be interesting. And just to set the stage, there are a lot of things that happened, and there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of frustration. But at the end of the day, the prism that I like to look at these things is how does it relate to governance and policy? These are not sports teams that you're cheering for the team with the red or the blue jersey. It has real impact about what are the policies that are used to govern our country and our state and our local municipalities and what impact that has on our daily lives. So,
yeah. And as you know, as our listeners know, we do focus primarily on New Mexico and with a impending legislative session. That would be plenty to talk about. But of course, the events in Washington, D.C. at the nation's capital are at the top of everyone's minds. And I felt we need to discuss some of these items before we move on because of their critical importance. As you said, these are not just red team, blue team issues. These are fundamental to the nation and moving forward and a variety of other things. So let's jump right into it. Obviously, I want to state at the outset that the riots and activity at the Capitol was terrible. Occupying and destruction of that building is particularly embarrassing and tragic for the nation. It's just not something that should happen in the nation, in the world's oldest democracy or democratic republic. Now, talking specifically about kind of the players at hand, we haven't gone into this again because we've been focused on so much going on in New Mexico. But I believe that Trump had every right, the president had every right to challenge in the court of law and try to prove his case for that there was some problems with the voting system. I don't think that has been shown to be the case at this point. I'd be interested in your perspective on that, but he certainly didn't convince any of the courts. And he had a rally, and I don't think that there's any real, if you actually read what he said, incitement there, but he definitely was selling his supporters a false vision of what happened in this election, as far as I can understand, based on the court decisions. Now, there could be evidence somewhere that somebody has and hasn't come forward with it, or statements and things that were done during this election cycle. And it's not to say there weren't issues, but the idea of outright fraud that changed the balance of power in this country, it hasn't been shown.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair assessment that it wasn't shown. That doesn't mean there wasn't some fraud, and that doesn't mean there's not problems with the voting system. One of the things that I look at is look at this election. Biden won, Trump lost, and Trump supporters are very frustrated and bring forth things that they believe, either truthfully or just they believe them, that there were problems that kept him from being elected. That happened in the previous election when Trump was elected on the other side. So, one of the things that is, and we've talked a little about this, the sanctity of elections, is there needs to really be a process that both sides are comfortable with and both sides agree on what the rules are. And there's a lot of things that I don't know if they're questionable, but there is not broad agreement. And I think these things can flip-flop depending on whether they're benefiting one party, one election, and another party, the other. The thing about, gathering up votes and, going door to door and gathering these absentee or ballots and then putting them in the mail in bulk, things like that. What are the rules we operate under? I think that is a huge thing that definitely does need to be addressed. And if it's not, boy, we're going to see, I think we're going to see more things like this. And again, I'm not trying to say, well, one side did it, the other side did it. But the key is that these issues have been swirling around and not just on one side for the last several elections now, at least at the presidential level.
Yeah, Hillary Clinton didn't exactly go quietly into the night when she lost to Trump. The lady down in Georgia, I forget the Democrat who led in many ways the voter turnout efforts for the Democrats, who claimed that she was not that she really felt she'd won the governor's race. The last 2 months, and you voted for Trump, as I understand it, both times. I voted for him the second time, but I don't think we, fully understood where he was going to go after the election. I think he really tarnished his own legacy during the election. He's got a lot of accomplishments in the policy realm to, justify his term in office, including 3 Supreme Court justices, tax cuts, which are also good policy in many ways. You know, he really was good to the energy industry here in New Mexico and across the country. And just a couple months where he refused to kind of acknowledge the election and called into question not just the other side, but people like Mike Pence, the Secretary of State down in Georgia. It's a lot of infighting now on the more conservative side politically, and that is going to be challenge moving forward. I do believe that protest organizers are responsible for maintaining order and discipline in a protest. And this is true for the BLM protests that happened this summer, including one here in Albuquerque, where there was a lot of destruction downtown and around the city. If you're going to have a protest, and I have protested before, mostly in Washington, D.C., you've got to keep your people under control. There's talk of Antifa infiltrators and those kinds of things. Well, then you've got to pull your own people back and say, no, we're not going to be a part of this, or do something. I know it's extremely difficult in these kind of large groups of people, but boy, when you look at people acting under the banner of X, Y, or Z movement, it does not look good for you when that situation turns violent.
No, and the history of violent protest in America is, for better or for worse, a pretty long one. This is not the first time. It's one of those. Early in my lifetime, there were a lot of violent protests in the '60s over things. And what is interesting is that whichever group is protesting and gets out of control, they always feel like they're justified, and that means is justified in their case, but in nowhere else. And we've seen that a lot this last year. There's been a lot of conflict between different parties protesting for different things and getting out of control on both sides. And it's interesting as a country, what the approach will be going forward. Are we going to have basically approved violent protests and unapproved violent protests? I don't know. Do we go down and get a certificate from the city you're in to say, yeah, this is something that you can go ahead and rape and pillage and burn, and this is an issue that's not? But we are at a place where there is a lot of frustration, a very divided country. We've talked about this a lot, and then this last week certainly did not do anything to tamp that down.
Yeah, and given all what you just said, the media's coverage of the summer's violent protest versus the way they've covered the Capitol protest, I don't think either of them are right. Property destruction, it's something that's near and dear to our hearts at the Rio Grande Foundation. We believe in private property, and we believe that, while the Capitol building is not private property per se, it's still the people's property and destruction of that is not appropriate, and there should be repercussions to the fullest extent of the law. But it's not whataboutism to say that the same should have been true this summer. And just because folks thought that they were on the right side of history or that they are advocating for an issue that needs to be discussed, and it does, but that doesn't excuse the kinds of destruction and violence that we saw this summer or at the Capitol. So that's kind of our takes on the issue, and I think
and just one final point is I think that law enforcement far and wide has shown that whether it be the rules of engagement or whatever, as we're in a way different position. You could have looked at the BLM protests and say that law enforcement let those things happen. And then this is completely from the other side in the Capitol. And so, it's one of those, there is a hesitancy in law enforcement, either a hesitancy or ineptitude to address these things. So that's another thing I think to keep an eye out for, because if that continues and, believe me, if you can get so much attention from this and there's not any repercussions, pushback, for doing violent protesting, don't be surprised if you don't get a lot more of it going forward. So,
yeah. Now, strategically and politically moving forward, I think the repercussions are even more interesting, troubling than what we saw either this past summer or last week at the U.S. Capitol. One of the big ones, of course, is just the sheer political talking point. Republicans and Trump talked a lot about law and order issues. President Trump, of course, made that a point, whether it's the border or just the violence this past summer. This certainly does not reflect well on kind of that law and order talking point or attitude among Republicans. It really undermines their credibility on the issue.
Yeah, and then the other thing, I've even been reading some stories that says, the Republican Party has been the party of the police, the party of law and order, that even beyond the fact that it didn't reflect well on that core traditional kind of right-wing Republican value of law and order, that there are people that consider themselves very conservative that are potentially starting to think less of the police. And I think that may have to do with the issue I talked about, their poor handling of the other riots that happened across the country. So yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah. And of course, it's always worth noting that the people who rioted and created mayhem last summer or at the Capitol are relatively vanishingly small percent of the overall movements of which they purport to speak on behalf of. But that is the way things are. When you have a large group of people and there's only, quote, only a handful of violent actors, those violent actors are inevitably going to draw the attention and become the news story. And again, it just gets back to kind of the strategic situation, but also in many ways the moral point that when you have these protests, you have to do a very good job of keeping your own people in line. And, dating back to the 1960s and Martin Luther King and the nonviolent protests and actions that they had, they were extremely judicious, not judicious, but disciplined, I would say, even more so, about keeping their own people in line. And that was a big part, I think, of that movement's success. And so these modern movements need to be more disciplined in their approaches.
Yeah, and then I do think that we're seeing just another one of the great things of social media, great being in air quotes here, that you can promote some protest in one way to get people out there, and then a very small group can turn that thing very violent. And that was something that certainly the 60s were noted for. And so with social media, it's just a lot easier to coordinate and a lot easier to gather a crowd of people who have frustration and then some. And so, I think a little later in the podcast, we're going to talk about some social media things, but, we're seeing a kind of another approach to social media doesn't, for example, Twitter canceled the president, but social media is shown to be a very double-edged sword when it comes to what shall we say, the conduct of politics here in the United States.
No doubt about it. Now, before we get on to social media, there has been talk among some on the right of a third party, possibly led by President Trump. And, I've been involved in third parties, mostly Libertarian Party politics in my younger days. Certainly don't begrudge anybody the choice of engaging in third party politics and efforts. There's certainly a valid approach to politics. However, when you get large movements that break off from their traditional base, the risk, and not just risk, but the history shows that you generally undermine whatever movement you're trying to build, because you inevitably split the group that you are most identifiable with. And I'll just note the many commonalities between the Bull Moose Party 100 years ago or so, when Teddy Roosevelt got frustrated at William Howard Taft, the Republican, and went off on his own with the Bull Moose Party. Well, what did we get out of that? We got Woodrow Wilson, who, in my estimation, is one of the worst presidents, if not the worst in American history. Very nefarious guy. World War I, personal income taxes, all kinds of things that really got rolling under President Woodrow Wilson. And, third parties are pretty dangerous things, especially, taking it here to New Mexico, where the Republican Party is almost at the level of a third party in terms of their effectiveness in the state. There's some local officials that are.
Yeah, we're lacking the second party in New Mexico at the rate things are going, unfortunately.
Right. So I just, while I understand the desire to maybe form your own party that is more directly responsive to your own goals and aspirations as a group, the fact is that America is a coalitional political system where two parties tend to dominate over the long term. It doesn't have to mean Republicans and Democrats. It has been other parties, but you really have very few times in American history where those changes have taken effect, and it's just very difficult to get a successful third party movement going.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And just to put a very purposely fine point on it, the history of third parties in America is to have frustration within an existing party where you only agree with, pick a number, 50, 60, 70% of the policies of the party that you're in. You form another party that enables the party that you agree with maybe 5, 10, or 15% of what they do, and you put them in power and give them the policy making ability. So yeah, it's a very interesting thing. And then because of how the parties are formed, again, is it theoretically impossible that another party could replace the Democrat or Republican Party over time? Theoretically, on paper, it definitely can be done. Practically, in the current state of things, how the parties work at the state and local and national level, the chances of that happening, I won't say are zero, but they're very, very, very low. So we'll have to see. This is the probably if the president who's leaving, Trump, decides to do that, he probably has a bigger political base than anyone who's ever tried to do that. But that, I still think even for him, it would be a huge, huge uphill battle that's not likely to be very effective. Oh yeah, and let's wait a minute. Trump is no spring chicken. So if he's signing on for a 30 or 40 year plan, actuarial tables are probably going to get them in the meantime. If not just political failure from trying to do that.
Yeah, definitely a challenging road to take if a third party is in the offing here. Now, in terms of nationwide public policy developments relating to the events of this week, the sudden move, not that they have been completely free of censorship. There is no question that companies like Twitter and Facebook have engaged in some degree of favoritism based on ideology and censoring and pushing back against whether it's President Trump and labeling his statements and tweets. Various other activities have been undertaken, but now I think it's risen to the level of outright censorship. Yes, these are private companies, but they are also incredibly powerful players in their field of social media, controlling the means by which people, whether it's President Trump or the Rio Grande Foundation or members of Congress or AOC or whoever they may be, communicate with large numbers of the populace and the media. And these companies, they've banned, Twitter has banned, well, Facebook and Twitter have banned Donald Trump from their platform, seemingly permanently. Numerous other major figures on the right have been pushed back upon or outright banned. And Parler, which is kind of the alternative Twitter for conservatives, one of the alternatives. As we record this on Monday morning, it has been taken offline entirely because they were hosted on Amazon web hosting formats and their
and then their apps being taken off of I believe the Apple, and I believe also the Google Android system as well. So yeah, Parler, I never got to know you at the rate it's going. I may never get to. So did you have a Parler account, Paul? Or
yeah, the Rio Grande Foundation, we set up a Parler account. Just enough people who we associate with on the right were engaged with Parler that we felt like, why not become part of it? And now, I didn't dive into the supposed depths of Parler and trying to really get a grasp on the system. The problem with these ideologically based social media platforms, in my estimation, is that they, by being generally people speaking to your own team, you're kind of losing a lot of the engagement that makes, especially Twitter, but to an extent Facebook, so interesting. And I'm happy to reach out to every conservative in New Mexico or even beyond to around the country, but my preference is to try to get to that mushy middle, the influenceable types who we might have the ability to kind of bridge some gaps ideologically with. And you're just not going to find people like that necessarily on a platform like Parler. It's ideologically already filtered, and then you're kind of dealing with it that way. But Twitter and Facebook, there's no doubt that they've veered into some pretty heavy censorship. At this point, the Rio Grande Foundation has not directly suffered a lot of that. One example of the counter on that is that I tried to put a tweet up by a local reporter on Facebook, and she was merely announcing that the legislature was going to be 100% virtual. I was advocated by Facebook software to boost that, to pay a little money to spread that message around. And then when it came into their political approvals process, it was actually rejected because it said it was too political, and I had to, I did not get approval to boost that particular post. But that is a relatively small proportion of what we've been doing or not doing on Facebook and Twitter. It's frustrating, it's troubling. I think it's very bad form for these social media platforms. And I'll just in the discussion, well, not in discussion, I'll give you the opportunity certainly to weigh in. We have the Rio Grande Foundation has been a part of for, a little over a year or so, a group called the Free Speech Alliance. It is hosted or led by the Media Research Center. If you listen to Rush Limbaugh or some radio host, you may have read what the mrc.org, they're all about. They try to watchdog the media on their bias, and they must be burning.
They must be, yeah. They're probably pretty busy these days.
Yeah. So anyway, it's called the Free Speech Alliance. It is a coalition of, broadly speaking, conservative organizations. You can read about their mission and what they're a part of. But the Rio Grande Foundation signed up pretty early on because I think we saw the writing on the wall with some of these media companies that they were not playing, balls and strikes. They weren't calling them fairly for both sides. And if you'd asked me even 4 or 5 weeks ago if we would be where we are now, I would have said no way. But that's the way things go.
Yeah, and then the final point in terms of what is social media, Parler is going to be an interesting footnote regardless of what happens to them. But social media has already come and gone in our lifetime. There was a time where I'm old enough to remember when MySpace was the social media platform, and Facebook was just this small little thing that a few college kids did. Well, Facebook has grown into this gargantuan social media platform, but there's signs of crumbling around the edges with that. If you talk to somebody who's in their 20s, they are not too enamored with the Facebook. They're on other social media. They've already definitely moved on. And so, there is a ebb and flow to these social media platforms. But I would have to say that, the thing is that, America is built on free speech. And just to clarify, the most protected form is political speech, which means not necessarily things that are based on data and science. They're based on opinion, political opinion, policy opinion. You can have things behind them, but if we're going to say, well, your opinion is not worthy, there goes free speech. And I don't think the government has done, particularly the federal government, has done too bad of a job of not stepping on free speech rights over the years. It seems like Facebook and Twitter, in a matter of days, weeks, and months, have done more damage to the opportunity for free speech than any government program or entity has done in the history of the country. So very interesting to see where it goes from here.
No doubt about it. Well, Wally, before we completely leave the issue of national politics, way back, once upon a time, like last week's podcast, we discussed the Georgia U.S. Senate race, which seems quite long ago at this point.
Long ago, and it seemed important back then, didn't it?
Yeah. And this is one of the, I think, disastrous aspects of, Trump's last couple of months in office, where he did a lot of things that I think really muddied the waters, attacked Republicans, generally freaked out centrist or moderate voters, unaligned voters, and it came back to bite him and Republicans where it counts, and that is the two Democrats both won. Warnock and Ossoff both won. I will bite the bullet and say that I thought one of the Republicans would squeak things out and win one of those two races. I did expect them to be very close. Wally, I went back and listened to it. I can't believe it. You punted on that question. You did not offer a prediction.
Well, and the reason I didn't is I didn't have any feel for that. I'd read a few news articles, but far be it from me to have my hand on or my fingers on the political pulse of Georgia. So, that's the only one I punted on, as I recall, though.
It's
so,
okay.
All right.
We'll forgive you. Nobody will be, well, we'll remember when they're driving very liberal policies through what exactly happened.
Yeah, that could be part of my bona fides in the politically correct future, as I didn't have an opinion on that one. So
Kamala Harris is breaking those ties in the U.S. Senate and pushing tax hikes and God knows what else. That will be remembered. But real quickly before we do move on, of course, very often, if we were doing this right before the legislative session, the news of the week, the news nay of the year might be that for the first time in history, New Mexico's legislature is going virtual, totally online. And it was alluded to, as I mentioned, about the tweet that the reporter had put out saying that the House, that she had talked to Speaker Egolf, and that the House would be going totally online. The Senate was not necessarily in the same boat. They make up their own rules. They have their own opportunities to decide what's going to happen. But this is going to be a most unique 60-day legislative session with the whole thing being held in Zoom meetings and various other virtual formats. It's going to be tremendously interesting, problematic, and I think there are even though the Democrats in New Mexico have really all of the levers of power, there are real opportunities for this whole thing to blow up in their faces big time.
yeah, it's one of those things that I happen to like Zoom for up to about 4, 5, 6 people. Beyond that, it gets to be a pretty cumbersome tool. The other issue is that there's a lot of discussions that happen both in committees and in the hallways of and committee rooms before and after. You know, not to beat a dead horse, we talk about this a lot. We have a citizen legislature here in New Mexico. They don't have permanent staffs working for them year round. They barely have staffs during the session. And so there's a lot of information that needs to be taken in. And, we've just taken one of the primary pipelines of that is people talking to each other in person before, during, and after these events and chopped it off. And made the assumption that this very structured approach of using Zoom, which, in some ways is just another form of social media, is going to be able to replace that. I think that, yeah, there could be some, Paul, dare I say it, unintended consequences of using Zoom for the whole 60-day session. You would almost have to say the likelihood of something going wrong and something weird happening is pretty darn high with this. So,
no doubt about it. Now, this is obviously not to undermine the case for virtual engagement in the legislative process. We have in the past and for some time advocated that Zoom or some equivalent technology should be available for people to testify before legislative meetings and committees. After all, this is a very big, geographically disparate state. If you are from Hobbs, New Mexico, and you have a very critical issue to discuss with your legislators, you're talking 5 hours in your personal vehicle each way to Santa Fe. That is not just a day, that's a full day, let alone what you're actually there to discuss. And we all know how the committee hearings work and how they run behind schedule and the schedule gets thrown completely out of whack.
Yeah, and the thing you went up for that day to talk about gets postponed. It's not this
Yeah.
Tuesday, it's Thursday. And so
Right.
what do you do? Yeah, it's a huge frustration, like you say, particularly with rural New Mexicans.
So if there is a silver lining, it should be that maybe this will be used moving forward. It should definitely be used moving forward, especially to enhance availability, enhance openness of the process. But I have real concerns about a totally online legislative session. So we shall see, and maybe there'll be some legal challenges to that as well. I'm sure that's up for discussion, and Rio Grande Foundation would be happy to step up and be a part of that. We got to have some conversations with attorneys, though, before we go down that path. Rio Grande Foundation wound up in the Sunday Albuquerque Journal. I always like to make sure people who might not read the journal, and now with social media and utter chaos, I wrote a piece. Politicians are creating a hole in the center of Albuquerque. And by what I mean by that is the folks at Cliffs Amusement Park, which really are a true small business. They are not owned by any parent company. They are right here in New Mexico. They were not open at all during the year 2020, thanks to the governor and her COVID-19 restrictions. I talk a little bit about that, and I've traveled to other places where they were more open with similar features. Other amusement parks, whether it's Disney in Florida or Ohio's amusement parks, have been open. There were specific, detailed recommendations made by the Amusement Park Trade Association to assure that safely opening was an option, but our governor did not see fit to join any of those other states, and we're one of just a handful, I think, 3 states that did not open or allow amusement parks to be open at all in the year 2020. And then I discuss mandatory paid sick leave, rising minimum wages, all of those, and how they are also going to negatively impact Cliffs. And, this is an institution that's been around for 6 decades. It hires hundreds of teenagers every year, every summer, younger kids, including my own, love to go there, form childhood memories that last a lifetime. Even though I didn't grow up in Albuquerque, I remember visiting as a kid and going to Cliffs, and it was one of the highlights of any time I spent here in Albuquerque. And it would just be a really unfortunate situation if, because of government policies, COVID and non-COVID, that Cliffs was forced to shutter, and that land was sold off and just became something else, because it's a special place for a lot of New Mexicans, especially our children.
Yeah, and when you're like New Mexico, the most shut down state in many categories and close to it in many others, you're going to have more. You're going to have more fallout from that, and that's just an example. So, there for a while, it seemed like the bowling alleys were on the risk of imminent destruction, and they got a reprieve, at least with regard to leagues. But the amusement parks, which, are outside for the most part, and not definitely a place where, I'm not sure I see too many 90 and 95-year-old people hanging out there. It tends to be a pretty young crowd, both in terms of the employees and the people are there. And, a place where, again, this is a theme I think that is maybe impacting places like New Mexico, California, New York, that are trying to be so shut down. It takes things that have the opportunity, maybe have some risk of spread, but have it controlled in such a way to give people an outlet for their desires, as opposed to just go off the deep end and go to large events where there's hundreds of people and no rules involved at all. So very interesting. But yeah, I did read that, and perished the thought that there would not be a Cliffs amusement park at some point in the future. So
No doubt about it. All right. Well, I guess we have to throw some good news out there. And we talked about this briefly, but I really wanted to expand upon it a little bit, and did so at errorsofenchantment.com. Posted a little chart. U.S. energy-related carbon dioxide emissions are at their lowest level since essentially the early 80s. And set aside the fact that the population's grown tremendously since then, our standard of living, et cetera. So wealth and generation of living standards has grown tremendously since the early 80s, along with the number of people. And yet our CO2 emissions as a nation have continued to drop rather dramatically. And of course, this was a COVID year. Certainly being locked down helps limit COVID emission or CO2 emissions.
Well, but there was a long-term trend despite
Right.
COVID. It wasn't like that this is a blip.
Right. They were down 11% this year in 2020. And I think the interesting thing is here with all of Joe Biden's talk, assuming the economy does reopen as we certainly hope and expect it will throughout 2021, it could very easily result in Joe Biden's first year in office seeing an uptick in CO2 emissions, certainly relative to the year 2020, which we know Biden has a lot in store for us when it comes to green energy policies, but that would be a fascinating little twist of fate if that were to happen. But yeah, it is some bit of good news that CO2 emissions in the United States haven't been this low since 1983, 84.
Yeah, there's been a lot of progress, a lot of things. I have not looked at that recently, but basically fuel economy and automobiles is a huge factor. Back in that days, a fuel efficient car would get 18 or 20 miles per gallon, something that was considered good. Now you can have a relatively large vehicle that can easily average that and well beyond. And then just efficiency. There's a lot of efficiency that's happened in a lot of sectors, and much of it has happened. It's interesting, Paul. When I say this, sometimes people look at me funny, but it's interesting that efficiency and low emissions is always the goal of every industry. It's one of those, it costs money. So anything that's emissions, the key is you never want energy for its byproducts. You don't want you don't produce, you don't burn gasoline because you want CO2. You want motion in your car. You don't want but just a tiny bit of heat. And so there's a lot of things that are going forward in that way. And a lot of people, I guess it boils down to the fact that if a government policy doesn't cause a tree to fall in the forest, does anyone hear it? But just the fact of industrial efficiency has done an awful lot towards moving the country in that way. And I won't say that there's nothing that government policy hasn't done. There's certainly some fuel economy standards that within reason have definitely encouraged the country to go in that direction. But that's certainly not the be-all and end-all, because the federal government has also enacted a lot of unattainable standards that they have to back off from many times, particularly during the Obama administration. So,
and don't forget fracking, the cheap natural gas, plentiful cheap natural gas that we've seen thanks to the hydraulic fracturing process has enabled utilities to move away from coal-fired electricity creation, production, and that really has also led to positive outcomes in terms of CO2 emissions.
Yeah, both from CO2 emissions, but also positive outcomes without causing electricity rates to skyrocket.
Well, true, right.
Yeah, which is something that we might be looking at. That skyrocketing thing, we might get a chance to look at that. We'll have to see.
Yeah, and lastly, United Van Lines released their mobility report, where people move to and where people move from using United Van Lines during 2020. Of course, this is a year unlike any other, and it's interesting to see how people were moving in the midst of this pandemic. If anything, the situation during 2020 only more starkly illustrated the desire for people to move towards greater economic freedom and away from big governments, for lack of a better word, from repressive governments in terms of their policies. Inbound states, the top ones were Idaho, South Carolina, Oregon, which is an anomaly there, but Oregon managed to get up there. South Dakota, Arizona, North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Florida, and Arkansas. So I would call 9 of those states solid red states, all of them but Oregon, right to work. So maybe Oregon's a nice outlet for Californians.
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe that's their slogan, not as repressive as California.
Yes. Now moving out is, of course, kind of a who's who of the blue states, mostly. New Jersey, New York, Illinois, Connecticut, California, Kansas, there's the anomaly on there.
Yeah, we don't know what we need to go to. We need a field trip to Kansas to figure out what they're doing wrong over there.
Well, just drive across it. You'll figure it out.
No, I
Then North Dakota, which in many ways resembles Kansas, and then you go to Massachusetts, Ohio, and Maryland. So, very much a tale of red states versus blue states. People are moving away from those high-cost states, and possibly that's just because they know they can work from anywhere now, and they want lower income taxes, lower cost of government, etc. And that's all very reasonable. Now, the most notable aspect of this for us here in New Mexico is that United Van Lines took the data a little bit further and looked at the primary reason for living. New Mexico.
leaving.
Yes.
Okay, you said living.
Leaving,
but
sorry.
They're good, but they're not that good.
Yes. Well, if you're leaving, you might be living.
There you go.
And that happens to be retirement. Inbound to New Mexico, 32.6% of the people coming to New Mexico were retirees, whereas the outbound was only 14.7. It's not surprising that jobs was not the most popular for inbound to New Mexico. It was much higher on the outbound side of things. Nor was it a surprise that the number of young people moving to New Mexico, by that I mean 44 and less, was relatively low, whereas the 65 and older crowd, that group did move to New Mexico in higher numbers. So this is a way of saying that the data are showing that not only is New Mexico's population aging, it is more rapidly aging as people who want to retire come to New Mexico, as opposed to younger families and whatnot. So definitely a serious challenge to our state moving forward. Wally, any last thoughts before we let it go?
So I think retirees are good, but I think, as you sort of alluded to, they're a pretty risky thing to base your entire economic growth strategy on. Having said that, we got a lot of retirees because this is a fantastic place to not work. We have nice weather. It's a lot of outdoor activities. It's beautiful. But I don't think come to New Mexico, don't work is necessarily needs to be our only strategy to keep our economy going and create opportunity for people. I think we need a lot more. But it's interesting. One of the things that we're doing the best in is something that we're disincentivizing by taxing of Social Security, something that's been proposed to do away with, but certainly hasn't gotten much traction in Santa Fe.
No doubt about it. Well, that was a eventful podcast, a lot to talk about, and we'll be talking about the upcoming session and having some exciting guests moving forward. But folks, with all the uncertainty going on right now in this world, definitely encourage you to share this podcast with your friends, family, neighbors, etc. And thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.